Fantastic. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming along to our workshop today on unconscious bias. My name is Annika Thielgaard. I'm the Peer Support Coordinator here at Bath, and my co-trainer today is Eleanor.
Hi there, everyone. My name's Eleanor Parker. I work here at the University of Bath in the Doctoral College as Doctoral Engagement Manager.
And our workshop today will introduce and explore the concept of unconscious bias and the implicit attitudes that shape how we engage with others and how we make decisions. You will have the chance today to reflect upon where and how unconscious biases interact with our experiences as both staff and students in higher education. We both became very, very interested in unconscious bias through our various work within admissions and with training student volunteers, from student ambassadors to peer mentors and beyond. And we've identified real scope within the university to develop our understanding of unconscious bias, and I really hope that you will join us on our journey as we do that today. This session does rely on your interaction, and we will be exploring differing views and attitudes throughout the session today. And it's really important that we do all agree to respect each other's viewpoints, opinions, as we share our ideas. So are we all in agreement that we will be respecting each other's opinions? Absolutely fantastic. We will make all our slides available following the workshop today, so you will have access to those after the session has finished.
We receive a huge amount of information in our brains. We receive about 11 million bits of information in each moment, and yet we can only consciously process 40 bits of that information. So what does that tell us? That tells us that actually the large majority of what we're receiving as information and the way in which our mind is processing it is unconscious. So we have a need here to filter information. We filter information on a daily basis in our very basic interactions. We might avoid a car. When we order our coffee, we filter information. We decide where we want to sit on the bus. But all the time when we're making those decisions, big or small, we see in action the workings of the unconscious mind. And that's something we're going to explore today. So as a demonstration of that, what I'm going to ask you to just do for 10 seconds is look at the image on the left hand of the screen. Okay. A very quick 10 seconds, but meant to demonstrate a very particular thing. So I'd like to ask the room, who can see a male-identified face facing to the side? Okay, thank you. And who can see a male-identified face facing forwards? And which of you actually saw both at some stage in your processing there? Okay, thank you. Part of the reason we've identified this kind of example, and you may have seen it in lots of other sessions on unconscious bias or pictures on the web. Annika and I have another favourite about a duck head. There's one with a dress that appears both black and gold. There are many of these sort of visual tricks out there. But what this demonstrates to us is that our unconscious mind works incredibly quickly and is totally out of our control. What are we receiving here? We might be receiving a visual stimulus, a verbal stimulus. We might be hearing something, seeing something, and all of those different experiences do something in our brain. Now, the bit of the caveat at the beginning of the session that Annika left out that I'm just going to remind the room is that we are not psychologists. Okay, so I do apologise to any of you who may be academics in the psychology department. But what's really interesting about the speed of the unconscious mind, if you Google tonight the speed of the unconscious mind, you will not find one single answer, as I tried to do yesterday, the day before, and last night. Psychologists are divided about the way in which we might be able to measure the speed of the unconscious mind, and even the way in which we presented it in terms of bits of information, some of them don't like. So that's just my academic caveat to say that this is a really interesting and fertile area for research. What we know is that it's very, very quick, and that it does all sorts of different things to our experience of the world. Annika.
So one of the key goals of today's workshop is for us all to understand that we are biased. You are biased. I'm biased. As a university, we are all biased. As a society, we are all biased. And that's okay. Part of this journey is us admitting to ourselves that we do have this bias, but recognizing that it matters. Because once we are aware that we have these unconscious biases, we can begin to take steps to minimize those. Once we've accepted that we have bias, it doesn't mean that we're doomed as a society. It means that we can recognize our biases and begin to take steps to minimize its impact on our environment and on our interactions. Bias doesn't have to be fixed. We have the power to recognize our bias and take steps to minimize the impact. And as we've alluded to, unconscious bias is bias that we are totally unaware of, and it's triggered by our brains making these very quick judgments and assumptions, and these shortcuts that our brain very, very quickly and very rapidly leads us to make judgments, and consequently we put people into social categories very, very quickly without realizing that we are even doing it. So when we meet people for the first time, we make these quick assumptions, we put people into social categories, but we need to be aware that we are doing this. So we can take practical steps to reduce the risk of biases occurring and consequently minimize the impact of bias in society. So we just want to give you a minute or a couple of minutes just with the people around you to start to explore what unconscious biases people or us as a society might have. Can you think of any examples of unconscious bias? And once you've had the opportunity to explore examples of unconscious bias, think about where these biases come from and why we have them. So with the people around you, just start to have that discussion about where unconscious biases might come from. We'll give you 1-2 minutes to do this, and then we will feed back.
We're going to have to move on to types of bias. So what we've been identifying here is what we've been looking at is effectively our natural people preferences. These are the various ways in which we naturally make judgments about those around us. There are a lot of words on this slide, and they're teeny tiny. Never fear, you will have the PowerPoint with you afterwards. But what I want to draw out from some of the examples we looked at is some different types of bias there. So the first one is what's called a confirmatory bias. So here we seek information which confirms an existing idea or preconception that we have. What is the risk there? It can mean that we can discount any information that doesn't fit that model or fit that pattern. How many people in here recruit students or staff as part of their jobs? Yeah, we're going to come on to this later in an activity, but let's bear that one in mind, certainly for any part of the recruitment process. Linked to that is a second type of bias called affinity bias. So here we're favouring those who look and sound like us. We immediately create divisions. There's an in group. These people are like me, and I'm going to identify with them. And these people are other, an out group, a group that is different and distinct. The risk there is that if we have the affinity bias and identify with those that are most similar to us, The risk is that we can fail to see their weaknesses. And that's a big one in recruiting students and staff. I used to be a student recruiter, and it's very, very hard as an interviewer to not say, that person is like me when I was 17. They will do well on this course. And what your mind can do is not see the possible ways in which they're not meeting the criteria, for example. And then the third one, and this isn't an exhaustive list, by the way, these are just a few key ones, is what we would call a social comparison bias. So here we're talking about individual identity and group identity. With any given situation, we place ourselves in relation to those other people. We compare others to ourselves, and in so doing, and this is the uncomfortable bit, but the bit that Francesca's asked us to engage with today, that we identify ourselves as better than the other. How do we feel about that position? Not nice, not great, actually. It can feel deeply uncomfortable, but I think it's a position we need to reflect on and consider. So in summary then, unconscious biases are all pervasive and we all have them. Though crucially, building on Annika's definition earlier, I want to highlight that we don't have to believe a stereotype for it to affect us. So bias is not about a value judgment of who we are as people. I am very biased. That doesn't make me a terrible bias trainer. It is, however, what it reminds me of is that bias, as we identified here in our sources list, our biases are not a marker of who we are, so they're not a fundamental core of our being in that sense of identity, but they're a marker of what we've been exposed to. Be that in our family situations, our work situations, from the media, our various cultural environments in which we might have lived. And so one way in which we might become more aware of our biases in relation to these different categories is by taking something called the Implicit Attitude Test, or the IAT for short. Has anyone undertaken that fun online test? Maybe I'm the only one who thinks it's fun. We've got a handout for you later, and if you're interested to find out a bit more about your own biases in relation to gender or sexuality, occupations, etc., it's one way, again, psychologists are necessarily divided about its efficacy and its predictive value. But nevertheless, it's a very interesting online test that you can take to give you some greater awareness of where those biases might lie.
And I think following on from that test, it might just surprise you, because certainly when I took the test and I was surprised by some of my own identified biases, and it's so incredibly useful.
So the final thing I want to reflect on there is that in all of those examples, and in the examples we draw out here, what we're doing is actually producing micro messages to people. They might be micro affirmations. So through something we say, we do, the position of our gaze might affirm the relationship between me and the person. So my colleague Rachel's there. She's going to hate me for doing this. I know Rachel, and I'm talking to her quite a lot. That immediately creates a feeling of Rachel being in my in-group. I'm ignoring Sean. That doesn't mean that I don't love working with Sean, but even that position of what I'm doing, the position of my gaze, could be what's called a microaggression or a micro-inequity. So in other words, I might actually be I might unconsciously be excluding someone, placing them as other. On the flip side, we can micro-affirm. So that might mean thinking about the way in which we give praise to our colleagues or our students. What kind of language are we using when we write references? We could do a whole other session on that. But I just wanted to introduce that notion of the micro messages. And then here, 4 factors, 4 things, again, not an exhaustive list, but 4 things that can make you more susceptible to the working of bias. So, number 1, task. If the job we're assessing has common stereotypes associated with it, our unconscious will immediately bring those stereotypes in our mind. For example, and it goes back to Nigel's point, nursing and teaching are stereotypically female-gendered. If we're assessing those jobs, we may be more likely to be unconsciously biased to think that women might perform better in that role. Again, we'll think about our life cycle here a bit later, but what kind of language are we going to use to advertise those jobs, and how do the words and images we use affect how someone might position themselves in relation to that role? Secondly, numbers. So when you look at a group of things, say a group of job applicants, if in any case there's a minority group, and in this sense I'm using the word minority meaning just outnumbered by others, not privilege or anything else. I can see there's at least one outreach officer in the room. What we do there is that for that minority group, our unconscious mind will automatically bring up biases associated with that group. Again, in my previous identity as an admissions tutor, we used to get a lot of, well, Australian students do well on this course. I'd say, right, I won't tell you who said that. I'm also aware I'm being recorded. And I would say to my colleagues, can I just stop you there? What is that statement about? What have you done there? And then actually, you'd pull all of those layers back. What did that mean? Last year, they admitted one Australian student who did quite well, but quite frankly, that student was probably the most exceptional student we'd admitted in 10 years anyway, irrespective of cultural identity. So do you see, there are these kind of examples that come up in our work all the time, especially when we're dealing with groups of students or staff that we're trying to recruit, perhaps. Clarity, thirdly. Whenever we don't have all the information we might need, our unconscious mind will fill in the gaps according to its own biases. That's statistically proven. It's particularly dangerous because if we're missing various pieces of critical information, it can lead us to make poor assumptions and not treat those applicants, students or staff fairly. And finally, perceiver. Thinking about us in that role as perceiver. We can be more influenced by the workings of our unconscious mind in certain situations. Low blood sugar. Sounds like a really easy one, but if you are interviewing staff or students, feed the panel biscuits regularly. We can also be more influenced if we are stressed, rushed, or overly emotional if we're distracted with some other aspect of our lives, perhaps.
So we've had a chance to explore the theory behind unconscious bias, but what we want you to get from this workshop is how you are going to apply that. So in your roles, either as staff or as students, we want you to start thinking about the life cycle of a staff member or of a student. If you are a staff member, think about the life cycle from a role being advertised to a staff member departing the institution. And if you are a student, think about from that moment you are interested in coming to university from where you graduate. And think about where unconscious bias might impact or have an impact at different stages during that life cycle. Please do, we welcome you to discuss your ideas with those around you, but try and build that life cycle and really think about where is unconscious bias having an impact at those key different stages.
The only thing I'd say is, again, I know a number of you in your job roles in the room, if you feel that actually you're better placed today to think about the student life cycle as a staff member, that's also fine, or vice versa. So in other words, if you're an HR person or a student who works with staff, pick whichever life cycle you like. In other words, there's one cycle of students from attracting students right through to they graduate, and there's that life cycle of staff from attracting staff through to they graduate. You've only got 5 minutes, so you're not going to build a whole cycle. If it helps you, think about your position in that life cycle, if you have a particular role, be it with prospective students or staff, current students or staff as they leave the institution. And just think of a couple of examples where bias in your processes and day-to-day work might be active. And then we'll share some ideas. Thank you. Absolutely. So the example here is about when students meet their new lecturers at the beginning of a unit. All of those kinds of interactions, face-to-face, email, the way in which you position yourself as a lecturer in relation to the students, the way in which you create that group identity or divisions, the way in which you respond to that student group. I used to have terrible trouble as a teacher in the university environment. I had favourite people who I knew would answer questions really well. And it's really difficult as a teacher to not do that and to kind of check yourself and say, no, I need to, just because I know this person might know the answer to that question and be able to answer it quickly, that might make my teaching environment easier, but it's not actually going to do the learning that the whole group needs to do. This is where we think in the student life cycle, all the various ways and areas where unconscious bias may be having an impact. From awareness of the university, what are we putting on our website? What are we putting on our imagery? What about the words in our prospectus? What about our representatives? That's our academics on open day. That's our outreach and widening participation staff. That's a student ambassador. It's anyone who has any interaction with a prospective student. Application and recruitment and selection of students, our admissions process, the current student experience, and particularly those issues around assessment and evaluation, I think are really key at the moment, through to graduation. And how we're framing our careers offering. How are we doing that for our students? And are we actually, what assumptions are we making about what our students might want and need to engage with in that area? And I just put two big arrows there, not minor things, of course, but basically students, staff, and any other stakeholders are all involved in this. And then my favourite, policy, processes and procedures transcend every single part of this life cycle and give us lots of food for thought. Annika, the staff one. So again, there's a very similar pattern here, but I guess what's particularly interesting here is the way in which staff might be promoted or not, the kinds of opportunities we might be given as staff or we might give to our staff members. Are you making sure that when those opportunities are available that you're giving them to the people who deserve them based on their ability to meet those criteria, rather than just because, for whatever reason, you have placed that staff member in your in-group? That's one for some thought after the session. Okay, so let's move on, Annika.
Okay. So what we want you to leave the session today with really is some practical steps that you can take to minimise the impact of bias. We will be providing a handout at the end of the session that you can take away and keep for yourselves. We also have some larger printed handouts that we would encourage you to place within your office spaces, within accommodation, and so on and so forth. But I think the key message that we want you to take away is that being aware of and willing to reflect upon your own reactions and behaviour is absolutely vital. Individuals can only work to correct sources of bias when they are aware that they exist. Simply knowing about implicit bias and the potentially harmful effects and judgment and behaviour might well prompt individuals to pursue corrective action. So although it's not always enough to just be aware of it. Being aware of it really is the most important step.
Okay, so our final sort of 3 calls to action are, number 1, hold yourself accountable. What does this mean? So research supports the idea that you can help make the unconscious conscious if you give yourself a moment to do so and reflect. What might that look like? Don't close in on the first decision that comes to your mind, especially when you're determining who to promote, who to hire, who to give that place to as a student, even who you might go to lunch with or socialise with in your work environment. Justify your decisions. If you're held accountable, you will be more likely to be less unconsciously biased. So tell people why you've decided what you've decided to do. And if your manager or others won't listen, write it down. That's quite an interesting reflective process. Of course, again, those of us involved in admissions and promotion and selection will know that you have to do that anyway, quite a lot of that. But even the way in which we write those notes is important.
But as well as holding yourself accountable, we can hold each other accountable and call each other out as well to ensure that we are going on this learning journey together. We encourage you to call out unconscious bias when you see it, as it can be such a learning moment for someone. Sometimes you'll be wrong, and that's okay. It's okay to accept that we are going on this journey and doing that collectively together. As well as that, justifying decisions of your colleagues. Ask your colleagues the question, how did they reach that decision? Ask them to explain how they came to that decision. And that conversation itself can be so, so powerful. Make decisions collectively. Don't isolate your decisions. Work with those around you. We can keep each other's unconscious biases in check. Group decision making is so effective for weeding out those unconscious biases, as no decision really should be made by a single individual, and people will be contributing different information and asking different questions. So essentially, we're in this together. Let's hold each other accountable. Let's work together to really ensure that we're keeping our biases in check.
So finally, Annika and I would like to encourage you to make it okay to call out unconscious bias. As we know, with many issues to do with equality and diversity, we are all contributors to cultural change and cultural shift in our institutions and elsewhere. We want you to walk away acknowledging your own bias, but also have everyone in your institution do the same. It's about getting the most as well from those around you. An equal and more diverse workplace makes for more productive, happier staff and students. The final thing we would like you to do is commit to one action. Annika.
So not everyone in here is in a position to influence selection criteria, university structure, measuring stats for success and so on. But we all individually have the power to be accountable for ourselves and how we respond to others. So we want you all to have one goal, to commit to one action. Our goal is to get everyone in here to commit to an action before they leave. So we're going to give you 30 seconds individually to just commit to one action that you are going to take when you leave the room today to minimise the impact of unconscious bias. And we're just going to give you 30 seconds to reflect on today's session and commit to that one action.
Thank you.